free ships and boats.
Y'all could wave to the camera, make your face known.
Hello.
Shalom.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so many of you guys are familiar with a lot of conservation programs such as the World Wildlife Foundation, and they are most known and recognizable for the flagship species that they put on their logos, such as the panda and the rhinoceros. Elephants and tigers are other flagship species, and these species are used for conservation efforts because they bring in a lot of money, because they're charismatic, attractive animals that people want to save. And so the problem with that is when they're bringing in a lot of money, most of the money goes to saving them, whereas with efforts to save them, it's not helping a lot of different species that need conservation efforts as well. And so a problem that conservationists see when they are trying to figure out the best way to put forth these efforts is how do they want to manage certain conservation. And so there are three main broad ways that conservationists will approach. One of the ways is to focus on each individual species and put conservation efforts towards these individual species. And so the problem with that is species that aren't as attractive or charismatic as, let's say, the lions, tigers, elephants, they don't get as much funding and they don't get as much attention as they should be. Whereas species like sea turtles, tortoises, and whatnot, they are getting reasonable funding for them. Another way conservationists will manage is to just protect the habitats from development. And this becomes an issue through political ways, as if you're not protecting it for a single species that happens to be on the endangered species list, then politicians have an easier way to stop these efforts and to combat your conservation efforts. But the third, and what I feel like is the most efficient way, is to focus on umbrella species. Now, umbrella species are species to where if you put conservation efforts in and focus on this species, that conservation will help and manage and conserve for a wide variety of other species, and not necessarily just them. So, and many examples of umbrella species conservation has proved successful. One of them is the sage grouse in Wyoming. Now this is a bird who lives in the sagebrush environment, and their numbers dwindled due to increased hunting and whatnot. And when conservation efforts were put towards them, it helped a wide variety of animals, up to 350 different species of animals. And one thing about this was, because you are protecting them, you were protecting a large variety of different habitats that they use, because they use not only the sagebrush for feeding and roosting, but they use like pine tree forest for breeding and whatnot. And so one main thing with that is, if you focus on a species that doesn't necessarily have the attraction and charisma as other species, it will be harder to get funding. But how to combat that is to kind of mask your efforts. And so you would use, like how the World Wildlife Foundation uses the panda. Not all the funding goes to the panda. They do put their focus on other umbrella species. And another example of an umbrella species is the gopher tortoise in Florida. University of Florida did a study that focused on which species. They took in different ecological criteria to determine which species would prove to be the most fit for conserving a wide variety of species. And they found that the gopher tortoise, because they live in a really wide variety of environments, from sand dunes to slash pines to longleaf pines, and they're ecosystem engineers, so they create burrows that many different species use for their different life cycles. And so with conservation, you can either focus on what is most efficient and what would be most beneficial for the wide majority of the animals and get the best benefits, or you can focus on what is going to bring in the most money and what is most beneficial for your cause. And what it'll really look like is, if you're preserving biodiversity, then the best bet that you want to do is find a way that will focus on preserving the most amount of species. And now we are open up to questions.
So I've always heard about keystone species, and
Yeah.
they sound similar to umbrella species. What is the difference between a keystone species and an umbrella species?
So a keystone species is a lot of different species are keystones and umbrellas, but a keystone species is a species that is most notable for that environment. So let's say, like in the situation with the gopher tortoise, they're not necessarily a keystone species, but the keystone species for many of their environments were like the red cockaded woodpecker. But the study that UF found was that the red cockaded woodpecker didn't really live in as wide variety of environments as the gopher tortoise did. So they didn't really overlap as being a umbrella species as well. Whereas umbrella species, they don't necessarily have to be the most attractive or the most prominent in that area. Conservation efforts for them will encompass many other species of animals as well. Thank you. Thank you so much for
No, I've gone through it before.